So this is a recording not live of Chav Dal and Amud Aleph. We are starting on Chav Gimel Amud Beis, about 6 or 7 lines up. And the Gemara says, "Bo minei Rav Yosef Breder Rav Nechunya." Says the Gemara, Rav Yosef, the son of Rav Nechunya, asked Rav Yehuda the following question: Mao sheniachon tfilav tachas mirashoisov. What is the halacha as it relates? Is somebody allowed to take his tefillin and put them underneath his head? Why would he be putting them underneath his head? As Rashi says, "B'layla kishu yashin," when he's going to sleep at night, in a way to keep them safe. We're not talking about the situation we are in Yudalid, as we had before, where there's a situation where one could be afraid of Nachrim, Melistim, or things like that, where one could even put a Sefer Torah underneath them and sit on top of it for protection. We're talking about a situation where one is going to sleep and one wants to keep the tefillin in a safe and secure way. Presumably, we don't mean anything like the world that we live in today, where there's absolutely no need for anything like that. But whatever it was in their days, that it was considered to be safer, more secure to put the tefillin nearby oneself. And so the question is, can you put it underneath your head when you go to sleep? Tags magaloisav like the Gemara said, we're not asking about putting it underneath your feet. Why should that would be really not very appropriate. That would be very inappropriate. Keep tefillin underneath your feet, but by your head, right? That is something that would be an honor, especially for somebody who's a special person. Like I mentioned, Yaakov Avinu, right? The pasuk says, "Ve'kach me'avnei hamakom," right? The Yaakov Avinu, when in beginning Parashat Vayetze, when he takes all the rocks, the Medrash says that in the morning he has one rock. How did it happen? All the rocks are fighting over who can get a chance to sleep underneath his head. So it's considered, so at least certainly with regards to rocks, to be an honor to be sleeping under a tzaddik's head. In any event, the question that we have is whether or not it is permitted to put the tefillin underneath the head. And the Gemara answers as follows. Amarle, Hachi Amar Shmuel, Mutter Afilu Ishta Ima. It's mutter to put the tefillin underneath the head when one goes to sleep, because we have a proof from Shmuel. Shmuel said that it's mutter even if one's wife is with him. What does it mean? It's mutter even if one's wife is with him. We will see further elucidation of what Shmuel was possibly referring to. But clearly, what Shmuel is saying over here is that it's mutter for a person to have his tefillin underneath their head, even if his wife is there with him in the bed. And if the wife is with him in the bed, we are assuming that there will be act of intimacy engaged, and nevertheless, that's not considered a bizayon for the tefillin. What do you mean it's not considered a bizayon for the tefillin? As the Ritva, others already note that what we are discussing over here, to be very clear, is we're talking about a situation where the tefillin is 100% in a covering, and that otherwise we would not have had the question at all. So the Ritva here writes as follows: Perish who carved the shamish mitasei. If his wife's with him in the bed, we assume that there's potential for intimacy. V'dafka b'kli b'soich kli. Must be talking about a situation where the tefillin is in its regular case, and then it's in an additional case on top of that. Because there's no big benefit of the being by the head versus the rest of the home. In those days, imagine we're not living in palatial homes with various rooms. We're talking about a situation where you're living in a sort of a one room. So the same rules would apply if you're going to keep them in another part of the room, right? If you're sleeping on the bed and it's in a different part of the room, you still need it to be kli b'soich kli. So it's not going to be changing the fact that it's by your head. Maybe if anything, it's a rebusa. It's teaching you an additional point, which is the tachas mirasheis of sagi b'kli b'soich kli. That when you put it in a kli b'soich kli, then even if it's by your head, meaning it's very close in proximity to the act of intimacy. Nevertheless, that's still okay. My timer, the shmiras and yavalim, because the kli b'soich kli is considered a good enough shmira. The vadatak mirasheis and mishamrin hem b'yosa. And if a person is putting in a kli b'soich kli, that is sufficient, and not just to matter it in a different side of the room, but even by a person's head will be sufficient. And again, as we said, the reason why one would put the tefillin mamish by the head as opposed to the other part of the room of the house is because it's the greatest shmira for the tefillin. So again, when we're talking about a situation, as the Ritva is explaining, is we must be dealing with a situation where the tefillin is kli b'soich kli. It's not just the tefillin are hanging there or the tefillin are in its regular kilyan. No, it's a kli b'soich kli, which will be the only way that will be permitted And then what we're saying is the efficacy of a kliva kli is so much that even if it's takas marashoisav and ishta is imai, it's still sufficient to be able to engage in acts of intimacy, and it is nevertheless going to be permitted because of the fact that it's the best shmira that one could have on the tefillin. Continues the Gemara, and the Gemara says as follows: Meisvei, is this correct? What Shmuel just said. We have a brayso that says Le'iniach Adam Tefillah Takas Magaloisav the nation Negbem Derech Bizaya Naval Manichan Takas Marashoisav. We have a brayso that says you're not allowed to put the tefillin underneath your feet because that's really bizayin, but you're able to put it by your head, underneath your head. But ve'im hayisa ishta imay asar. But if you have your wife there with you in the bed, then it's asar. But if it was a situation where the tefillin would be 3 tefachim above or 3 tefachim below, so it wouldn't be sort of eye level with you with the bed, then it will be permitted. The point is here that this is a question on Shmuel because of the fact that Shmuel said that it is permitted to put the tefillin takas ma'ashoytzav afilu ishta imai, and over here in this brisa, what we are saying is that in hayasa ishta imai, it is asur, it is forbidden. Again, if it's makim, it's gavaya or no makim tefachim, then again it can become mutter even if it's ishta imai. But let's for the moment assume that it's we are talking about takas ma'ashoytzav. Literally, there's no difference, there's no change in terms of the latitude or whatever the exact term is for where the tefillin are. It's exactly with where you are, and nevertheless, we're saying that it is asur. In Isa Ishta Ima is asur. This would be a kasha on Shmuel. The Gemara answers as follows: Tiyufta the Shmuel Tiyufta. You're right. This is a kasha on Shmuel. It shlogs up Shmuel. Nevertheless, I'm Rava Afagav the Tanya Tiyufta the Shmuel. Hechazakav say, even though we learned that this is in fact a question on Shmuel and shlogs up Shmuel, nevertheless, the halacha is still like Shmuel. Right, so we say even though the halacha should seem not to be like Shmuel, that is, that a person should not be able to recite the Shema. I'm sorry, that a person should not be able to have the tefillin, takas marashoysav, if his wife is with him. Nevertheless, we paskin like Shmuel, even though we have a brayso that contradicts it. How could it be? Says the Gemara, my time as we turn now to Chav Daled on an Aleph, because kol lenitzurin utfei adafim bizyoni, as the Bach points out. Now, when it comes to watching it, it's more valuable and more important than the bizayin that is related to. Now, if you had an option to put it by your head versus put it by your feet, of course you put it by your head. You don't put it by the feet. That's a bizayin. That's unnecessary. But it's a bizayin also to put it by the head. True, but that's also the best security. And we know we've already had before, as Rashi points out in the top Rashi. We already said before that when they were trying to figure out how to keep the tefillin in a safe and secure way, when they had to go to the bathroom in those days in the outhouses, basically say kavuas, etc., they put it in the churn, which was samach and basically say in the churn of the chalonis that was samach to the rishos harabim. They did various things because they were worried about Ovid Devrachim, they were worried about Achbarn, they were worried about Chshad, all the things that they were worried about. So they had to change it in order to be able to keep the tefillin safe and secure. So here, what we're saying is, it may very well be true that this is not ideal to keep the tefillin in a situation like this, which is by your head, ishta imay. But nevertheless, since it's the greatest way to protect the tefillin, we are going to say that the shmir is adif from the bizayin, and therefore the halacha is like Shmuel, that a person is able to put his tefillin underneath the head, even if his wife is with him in the bed, as the Ritva pointed out. This is talking about a situation of kli b'soich kli. Continues the Gemara. Okay, so now that we know that you're able to put the tefillin takas marashoysav, practically, what does that mean? Omar Yirmiyah ben Karla says you put it between the mattress and the pillow. Shaloi keneged roshay. That's not exactly by the head. In other words, your head is not literally using the tefillin as your resting place, but it is nearby. It is meaning by the pillow and the mattress. So you're sleeping your head on the pillow, and this is between the pillow and the mattress. And so, in a sense, it's underneath your head, but it's not directly you lying on it. Says the Gemara of Hatani, Rabbi Chia, Manicha Mikova Takas Merashoisov, Dimafik Leila Morsha, the Karvelavar. So, didn't we learn, says the Gemara, the Rabbi Chia said that a person could put it in the koivar. Koivar actually says is the kiss, shalahem, right? It is the sack, the package that it is the filling is placed in, that a person could take that and put that tachas marasha. So he puts it underneath the head, the actual sack of the tefillin, the actual container that has the tefillin. You could put it actually underneath his head. However, the kesher of the tefillin, the that part of it is going to be sticking out, and that will not be literally underneath his head. Fine. So a bit of a difference, maybe a little bit more of a risky place to put it that much closer to your head instead of between the pillow and the mattress. Bar kapara tzir lehubik kilso umapik l'mashem lebar. Bar kapara would hang it by his bed post, by I guess like a curtain around the bed or something like that. And again, he would also have the kesher of the tefillin pointing outwards. Rav Shisha Bered, Rav Yidi Manach Lahu Ashav Shei Upar Sudra Alayu. He would put it by his, like, I guess a couch or something like that next to the bed, and he would cover it with some sort of garment. So all the different ways that people would put the tefillin near their heads, around their beds, to give it the best protection when they went to sleep. Omar Rav Hamnuna Bered Rav Yosef. Rav Hamnuna, the son of Rav Yosef, said, Zim Chod came the Rav. He says, one time I was by Rava, V'amrli Zilai Tefillin, and he asked me to get him his tefillin Vashkichino, Bain, Karla Kesa Shloik Neged Rosha, and I found it in his bed, the tefillin, between the pillow and the mattress. That was not exactly where his, 100% connected where he had slept. As we had said before, this was the position of Rabbi Yirmiyah. So what does that mean? So the Gemara says that Rav is asking this Rav Nuna, Rabbi Yosef, to get him his tefillin. It was meant to make a point. The Havi Yadana, the Yom Tefillah and I knew that this was obviously him saying that there was a Yom Tefillah here. And he's kind of teaching halacha l'maisa where you're able to put the tefillin when you go to sleep. So he's letting me know that the halacha is like Rabbi Yirmiyah. In order to teach me that, he told me to go get his tefillin. In which case, I saw that he was in bed where he slept, and I saw that that there was a yom tefillah. Who's the yom tefillah for? Rashi says that it was the yom tefillah of his wife, and they were being intimate. That's again unbelievable. Makes us think about the Gemara and the end of Brachot Samach Beis Tarihi V'Lumad Ani Tzarech. Again, that is additional point here to note is that when Rava is telling him, when Rava is telling Rabbi Hamnuna, Rabbi Yosef, to come into his room to go get his tefillin, he is understanding what he's going to be seeing, and nevertheless that was fine for Rava. Again, Tari Luan Anitzarch, and that, according to Rashi, means that he would now know that they were intimate, and his wife had her Yom Tefillah. The Ritva brings down another possibility. I'm not sure if it's a distinction with a difference though. According to Ritva, it could be it was Yom Tefillah of him. In other words, that he was titled for being Baal carried. Again, based upon the Gemara that we've already had before, where we just went through the whole thing on Chav Beis about whether or not that was still necessary. We had pointed out the Bidbar Meseira had said that in the return of Kabbalah Tumma, then maybe this is no longer relevant. Nevertheless, maybe it was his Yom Tefillah, and that's what he was, informing him of in that sense. But either way, in both cases, would mean that there was some intimacy. So either way, Tari V'Lumad Ani would still apply. But interestingly, in the case of Samach Beis, it was the student who was chasing after the rabbi to find out the halacha, whereas over here it would be the rabbi who's teaching the student these areas of halacha. Excuse me, despite the implications. Okay, continues the Gemara. We are now in the narrow lines, about halfway down. So this says Gemara, another question that we have from Rav Yosef, the son of Rav Nechunya, may Rav Yehuda. What is the question? So a new question. Two people are sleeping in one bed. Mahu shezeh yachs upon a vikar kriyashma, v'zeh yachs upon a vikar kriyashma. What is the halacha in relation to one turning his head away from the other and reciting the Shema, and vice versa. Is that permitted or not? Again, Shmuel said afilu ishtaimai. So now, before we had Shmuel afilu ishtaimai, that said that you could be reciting. I'm sorry, that you could be putting this tefillin underneath your head, even if your wife is there sleeping with you in the bed. And now we're saying that Shmuel says that you are able to recite the Shema even if your wife is with you in the bed. Remember, in those days, people were going to sleep and they were not dressed. And the question that was asked, if you have two people in a bed, are they able to say Shema if they're not dressed? One's going to turn their head and say Shema, and the other one's going to turn their head and say Shema. Is that sufficient? So Shmuel said, yeah, it's sufficient because afil ishtayima, if your wife's with you in bed, both of you are not dressed. Nevertheless, you're still able to say the Shema by turning one's head. That is the Gemara's answer to the question that Rabbi Yosef, the son of Rabbi Chana, asked Rabbi Yehuda. So the Gemara now continues, and the Gemara says the following: Maskevle Rabbi Yosef. Rabbi Yosef asked the question, Ishtoi, from this answer that Shmuel gave, it's mashma of afil ishtoi imoi, that with one's wife it's mutter. But what about others? What about if it would be two people sleeping in bed? It's not a person's wife. It's a friend. It's another relative. Maskevle Rabbi Yosef Ishtoi. The answer seems to be from Shmuel, based upon a question, the way it was phrased from Rav Yosef ben Rav Chunya to Rav Yehuda, was Shnaim sheishen b'mita achas. Two people are sleeping in one bed. Didn't mention their degree of relationship. Presumably, two people sleeping in one bed are going to have some degree of relationship, but it doesn't say. It doesn't say husband and wife. So it could be just two acquaintances, right? They're going to sleep in the same bed. So in that situation, we want to know, what do you do about the Kriya Shema? Is it sufficient to simply turn your face and recite the Shema? On that, the Gemara said, all right, yeah, for sure, because we know that Shmuel says that even if one's wife is with him in the bed and they're both not dressed, that one turns the head and recites the Shema. So therefore, a situation where it's not with one's wife in the bed, then that would be permissible as well. And obviously, it's not talking about here another woman, because that would, by definition, be not allowed. So we must be talking about another man, and we're talking about another man where all we're saying is needed is to simply turn your face and recite the Shema. So now Rabbi Yosef is asking a question. You're saying that it's a wife, and it's not a question about anybody who's not relation, and just a regular random acquaintance. Of course, they'll just simply turn the head, and that will be sufficient to be able to recite the Shema. Says the Gemara, is that true? Adarabba ishtoi kegufoi acher lav kegufoi. When it comes to a wife, there's, well, we know the famous phrase in halacha of ishtoi kegufoi. As Rashi notes, what it means is over here is that a person is used to his wife, and so what's the problem of having two people in bed that they're not dressed? Problem is a situation where somebody's going to become too excited, and therefore not have sufficient kavanah as it relates to the Shema. So when it comes to a wife, ishtoi kegufoi, so a person's rogel b'kach, so this is a certain regularity, so v'leka here kol is not such a level of here, so that's why it could be mutter, and that's why Shmuel could say that vafil ishtoi imai makes sense, a wife. But to say that about somebody else who's not not a wife, then maybe the same thing would not apply. And therefore, if it would not apply, maybe it would not be sufficient to simply turn your head and recite the Shema. So that is the question that Rav Yosef is asking on the bringing down of Shmuel to answer the question that Rav Yosef asked Rav Yosef ben Chunya asked Rav Yehuda. So on that, the Gemara says, one second. Meisvei, that's your question. We have a brisa. Brisa says like this. If you have two people sleeping in one bed, one turns his head and recites, and the next one turns his head and recites. We have another verse that says, and we have another verse that says that if somebody's sleeping in a bed, then he has his whole family with him. He has his kids and he has other members of the household with him. So the halacha is that he cannot recite the Shema. Unless he has a talis that's being mafsik between them. It's not sufficient here to simply turn the head. But if they're very young, then mutter. Then they would all, this will be mutter. Now, the first thing to understand is that what are we talking about in these two brises? One of them was talking about a situation of shnaim sheshinim into achas, no mention of wife, two people sleeping in a bed. And we said zem machzapanav occur. And this other brise doesn't say anything about a wife. It says banov b'nei beisa b'tzila, his children and the people of his household. What does that mean? Rashi explains as follows. What does it mean? A situation of banov b'nei beisa. So the Gemara says that Bishlam the Rabbi Yosef like kasha. According to Rabbi Yosef, who believes that with a wife it's a certain regularity and a certain comfort, there's less hair, so therefore it's more normative to be able to recite the Shema, even though one is not dressed, one can simply turn the face and recite the Shema, but that cannot be extrapolated to a situation of somebody's in a bed with somebody who's not their wife. So it says the Gemara Bishlam, the Rabbi Yosef like kasha b'ishteha ba'acher. According to Rabbi Yosef, it's not going to be a problem. Why? Because one bride which says zem achzapanav occur, that's simply talking about a situation with a wife, and the other bride that says where you're yashin mita barav b'nei beisa, and all of them are with him. So that we said that you can't say the Shema. So that's not a wife, and that's exactly like Rabbi Yosef said. Only by wife there's a certain regularity that we're more mako, but everybody else has to be mafsekes. You can't just simply turn your head and recite the Shema. So it works out nice according to Rabbi Yosef. Now, Rashi points out, what does it mean, banav b'nei beisoi? Rashi says, Bishlam Rabbi Yosef Dama Ishtahu Deshar Yaval Acher Loi. Right, it makes sense according to Rabbi Yosef, who says that when we make it by a person who is in bed there with his wife, that's when we're going to be makel, that's when we're going to be matirit, but not with anyone who's not the wife. Mitar Sulmas Nisa, we're going to explain these contradictory brises. And one is with the wife, where we makel. And it says that part of a curve, that max upon of a curve. But the other brise that said that we say no until you have a task that's mafsik, you can't recite the Shema. That's not the wife, right? That's why we have to be more machmer in that situation. So that works out well according to Rabbi Yosef. Says the more really. So it says the more Shmuel kasha, but the way Shmuel learns that a wife is going to be makel the same way it's going to be makel by anybody. So if that's true, then why is it that one Bryce says that Zemachs upon of a curve, Zemachs upon of a curve, but the other Bryce says that if he's in bed with Bana B'nei Beis B'tzidai, he has to have a talis mafsekes, otherwise he cannot recite the Shema. Why does he say Zemachs upon of, Zemachs upon of? So now the Gemara says, not an answer. Shmuel's not coming here to answer up the way he learns in these Bryces, but rather to say that Rabbi Yosef doesn't have it so easy. Says the Gemara, Amar L'cha Shmuel, L'Rabbi Yosef Minicha. So Shmuel, do you think it's so much easier, so much better for Rabbi Yosef the way he learns? V'atani, we have another brisa. The brisa says, "Yasham b'mita." If somebody's sleeping in a bed, b'nei beisa b'mita. The back takes out the word abanav, and the b'nei beisa, meaning the people from the household, are also in the bed with him. Lo yikor kriya shma'alim k'nes talisim mafsekes b'nei. He's not able to recite the Shema unless his talis is mafsek with him. So now, what is the case that we're talking about? What does it mean that b'nei beisa are with him? So as we already pointed out, as Rashi already noted, Bnei Beisa is not Ishta, meaning it's not just Ishta, it's referring to other people as well. But in this brisa where it says, Yoshim Rita Bnei Beisa, and as Rashi says, Ishta B'chal Beisa, the wife is a part of the bias, so she's there in the bed. And nevertheless, we're saying what? Nevertheless, we're saying that there's no ability for the person to be master upon a kari has to have mamash talisim afsekas. So, according to Rabbi Yosef, that shouldn't be necessary because since his wife is going to be here, at least with regards to the wife, he should be able to be master upon a kari. But we don't make that distinction here at all. So the Gemara says, therefore, Elamai, what are you going to have to say? Elamai Sechol Ishtar the Rabbi Yosef Tanoi. You must say that this brisa, which is talking about a situation where his wife there with him in the bed, nevertheless, we're not saying max upon of a kairei. We are saying it has to be mafsik with a talis. So it must be Smachlekes Tanaim. So L'didi nami Tanai. So it's a Machlokes Tanaim for me also. You know, don't ask me questions that steers and brises. There's certain Tanaim that hold that a person is able to master upon a Vikari, and certain Tanaim hold not. And Shmuel says that by everything. It's not just a wife. In a bed, it's anybody in the bed. You're always able to be master upon a Vikari. Konshab Yosef, it's clearly he is more making when it comes to the wife in the bed, and others he's more machmir, and there's clearly Machlokes Tanaim on that, whether or not one has to be more machmir or not. Fine. So that's how the Gemara concludes here. Just want to point out that according to Rashi, when it says B'nei Beisai, Rashi says, obviously, Ishtai B'chal Beisai. How many times in Shas do we find Ishtai, right, when it says Beisai, Beisai Zu Ishtai. It's very fascinating because Taisa says that Rashi is not correct. Taisa says, Chada de loy ashchan Ishtai de Makri B'nei Beisai. He says, we never find that a wife is called a bias, a bnei besa. We find that it's called besai, right? Obviously, the Gemara says many times besa is zu ishtai. Nevertheless, we don't see him called bnei besai. But I always find it very funny this Tosfos because in all the Hasidic wedding invitations that I get from my family, it never says a husband and wife, right? It doesn't even say a husband and vireyosai, which sometimes says in some places. Here, in the Hasidic invitations from Satmar, it always says that whoever XYZ is, Ubnabayas, right? The Ubnabayas is the wife. They're inviting you to the wedding. It doesn't say the wife's name, right? The same way they don't have pictures, they don't have the wife's name. But Tais is saying that Benabayas doesn't refer to a wife, and clearly this Tais indicates that that this understanding of Tais has not upheld, and clearly today people refer to Benabayas as the wife. So according to Taisus, if the Benabayas is for sure not the wife, then what's the question of Yosef? If we're not talking about the wife, then of course you have to be mafsi with the talis. So Tais says you have to have a different girsa. So Tais goes from Yosef. The Garsina Yashim Mita Vishta Yishana Betsida. We're talking about a situation where a person lying in the bed, his wife's with him. So then Lo Yachsa Panavika, he cannot turn his face and recite the Shema. Elim Ken Talisim Afsekes Ben Levena, which would of course be then a Machlekes in the Tanoim. So Taisus wants to come out again. Like I said, the only way Taisus can make it work is by having a different Gersa in the Brisa. Fine. Continues the Gemara. Amar Mar Zeh Machsa Panavikare Kriyashma. We said the solution in a situation where somebody's lying in a bed and they are accompanied by someone else and they are not dressed. So the halacha is Zeh Machsa Panavikare Kriyashma. And right, Zeh Machsa Panavikare Kriyashma. He should turn the face and recite the Shema. Says the Gemara, when we're talking about here, obviously not majorly wide beds, and you're now going to turn your faces opposite directions. So now you're going to have other parts of the body that are going to be touching each other, and those other parts of the bodies, what do you gain? You still now have a situation of erva. So the Gemara answers, Messiah Leila Rav Huna, the Rav Huna Aguvais Ein Bahem Mishum Erva. The Rav Huna says that the backsides of a person are not the same type of erva as it will be on the front ends of people. So it says the Messiah Leila Rav Huna. Let's say this is a riot to Rav Huna. That Haisha Yeshevetz Room, a woman's able to be taking challah, making a bracha, etc., while she is not dressed. So the Gemara says, she's able to cover her areas that are to be considered erva in the ground. Says the Gemara, says the Mishnah, but not the man. That is to say, the Gemara wants to prove from this that the aguvais of a person, the backsides of a person are not considered erba, because you see the woman is able to be kaitza chala even though she's aruma, because she's able to cover the front part of her body. So you see, you're not concerned about the back part of the body. Why are you not concerned about the back part of the body? Because that's not considered erba. And now the Gemara says, really? Taking Rav Menachem Bar Yitzchak, no. From a situation where her whole sort of lower regions were ensconced in the ground, and so therefore it's not a riot from here that the backsides of a person are not considered erva. It could very well be considered erva, but from this mission you will not have a proof. So the Gemara continues. Amar Marim Hayu Banav Bnei Basic Tanim. What happens if someone had a situation where his children, people of his household, they're young? The halacha is mutter. Then it will be mutter. So we are now explaining that the brayso that we had before, which said that if somebody's in the bed and it has the butt of an base b'tzidai, so he shouldn't say the shema unless he has a talis mafsekes. But the brayso continue, and it said of him hoya banav of bnei basic tanim, if they're very small, they're very young, then it'll be mutter. So now we want to explain what does it mean? Im hoya banav bnei basic tanim mutter. What does that mean? The ad kama, how long or how much are we talking about that they are ketanim? And what age is that exactly they're considered ketanim? Amar chizda tinagis bas shalish shonim v'yom echad v'tinag bentesh shonim v'yom echad. By a girl, it's 3 years, and by a boy, it's 9 years. It could be a good girl's 11, and by boy, it's 12 years old. But everybody agrees that if they hit puberty, then that would be a situation where that would no longer be considered ketanim. Again, there are debates and discussions about when someone hits puberty very young, or when someone doesn't hit puberty and they hit the right age. But that is all stuff that we cannot get into at the moment. So the Gemara continues, and the Gemara says as follows: Omar le Rav Kahana le Rav Ashi. Rav Kahana said to Rav Ashi. Obviously, this is not the Rav Kahana that we've had come across before. I remember, as we said, there were 4 different Rav Kahanas. This Rav Kahana talking to Rav Ashi must be one of the later Rav Kahanas. So Rav Kahana said to Rav Ashi, Hasam Amar Rava, on the page before on Chav Gimel Amud Beis on the bottom, we had said that Rava said, Afagav the Tiyuf to the Shmuel Hachasakavasei, that even though halacha is like, even though the Bryce is upshlug Shmuel, nevertheless the halacha is still like him. Hachamai, what is that halacha over here? Right? I don't really understand the question per se, because over here when we tried to shlug up Shmuel, we did come up with an answer, right? Shmuel didn't have an answer for himself. We said it's not so obvious that Rav Yosef is right. It must be Tzmach Tanaim. So he has Tanaim go like him, and I have Tanaim that go like me. So there wasn't really a situation where you had an upshlug of Shmuel. Vafilu Ishta Imai. Shmuel says that a person is able to recite the Shema even if his wife's with him in the bed. What does that mean? Even if his wife's in the bed in relation to others? I don't know. We could discuss that. Rabbi Yosef, there are other positions, but the fundamental idea that Shmuel says Afilu Ishta Ima, it's mutter to recite the Kriya Shema, that you don't have to do more than Zeb Masa Panavikarev, Zeb Masa Panavikarev. You don't have to wait until Talisim Seconds, so that I don't see as being upshlock. So I'm not really sure I understand the question. Nevertheless, the Gemara says that Rav Kahana asked Rav Ashi Hasan Rav if the Shmuel, even though we said before that when we upshlock Shmuel, nevertheless the halacha was still like Shmuel, as we pointed out, because watching the tefillin is a vital concern, and therefore, even if technically maybe there were brises that seem to disagree and say that a person shouldn't be putting his tefillin taxim Rashoisov when his wife is with him, nevertheless the halacha is still like Shmuel, and we can do so because that's the best shmirah. Hachamai, what is the situation over here? If a person is able to simply just turn the head and recite the Shema when he is undressed and his wife's undressed and they're together in the bed. So I'm like he's asking him back. Rav Ashi is asking Rav Gana, what are you bugging me? Like, do you think everything is woven of the same cloth? Where you have a statement from Rav, where Rav said that the halacha is still like Shmuel even if there was upshlag. So then that will be the case. But we didn't say specifically. Then we don't know. We don't know. And again, this is making the assumption that Shmuel is upshlag here as well, whereas I don't necessarily see that as being so obvious. Nevertheless, as we said, Amalei Rav Mary Lirav Papa, Seir Yetziv Vigdamau. Another question: what happens if Seir here from the nether regions? If that's showing outside of Bega, what is the halacha? Karala Seir Seir. He said here. In other words, you're asking too many pedantic questions. All right, it's like not a fundamental point. Says the Gemara, this next Gemara here is a massively important Gemara for halacha. Unfortunately, we don't have the time to go and delve into any of the details in great detail. I'll just mention one famous Aruch HaShulchan, which it's important to know. And aside from that, we'll have to leave it. Maybe we'll mention one other thing. We'll see. If there's a tefach that's open by a woman, then that would be considered erva. So the Gemara wants to know, what do you mean? Tefach bi'isha erva. If there's a tefach of skin that's owned by a woman, that's considered erva lamai. What is this halacha that you're coming to teach me? Are you saying that it's erva that you're not supposed to be looking at it? Why did the Torah enumerate the various different things that they took from the Midian when they went? They came nikmas b'nei shom esam midyanim achar te'ah sefer lamecha. So they came back. They had captured, they had destroyed Midian, and they got various different things. Among the gas tabas, ogel, v'chumaz, they got various different things. And so some of these takshidim are considered takshidim shebechutz, and others are considered takshidim shebefnim. What does it mean takshidim? And that's said of it's samid, right? These are takshidim shebechutz, but the takshidim shebefnim is like a chumaz. What's a chumaz? A chumaz, as Rashi says, is a chastity belt, and they would make it in such a manner that it would be impossible to be engaged in any sort of ma'ases zenus. So Rav Shai says, why did the Torah bring together these different types of tachshidin, which are not for the same purposes? They're not being utilized in the same way. So to teach you, to teach you that the tachshidin shebechutz is just as potent as tachshin shebefnim. That is to say, isha, right? Even etspektana, even nothing, just a finger, that is still considered makom haTorah. That's like an inner tachshit. In other words, when we're saying tefach b'isha erva, we're trying to figure out what is the point of telling me that the halacha is that tefach b'isha is considered erva. It's pashit. The Psukim already told us. That's other the pasuk already told us that sort of it's summon tabas agav v'chumaz. These are tachshidin shebechutz tachshidin shebefnim. The teacher call mistakel, and by the there is a debate. Mistakel is different. Mistakel is to steer at something. Does that mean steering is usher, but just looking or seeing is not? Is there a difference? Okay, we have to we can't get into that right now. But kol mistakel be'etzbektanav shel isha gil mistakel makom haTorah is telling you that of course it's pashut, it's obvious. Even the most little finger of a woman would be considered inappropriate to stare at such a thing like that. So therefore, tefach b'isha erva is not a chiddush. I already know that. So el b'isha the kriya shema. The chiddush must be it's coming by a wife and by kriya shema. That is, if a woman who is a wife to a husband and the husband is there with her in the bed and she has a tefach of her body that is uncovered, that is nevertheless still considered erva. And the person, the husband, should not be reciting the Kriya Shema in that kind of situation. So, again, what does that mean for practical intents and purposes? Is it simply sufficient, like Shmuel said, that if a person who maps in front of a kari, turn your head and you can recite? Or is there some additional requirement that's needed? We're not going to be able to explore practical halacha here, but that is clearly the indication from this is to say that just because the one is ruggled by an isha, and as we said, ishta kegufoi, and therefore we thought here will be less. So therefore maybe she will make it when it comes to being able to say Shema. Simply being max upon a kari is sufficient, and you shouldn't have to go get some sort of a divider, right, and have a talis nafsekes beinein. Is this tefach b'isha erva coming to slug up that? Is that coming to challenge that and coming to say no, that it's considered arayas and you need more of a separation than just simply turning your head? Again, we have to leave that on the side. Amar Rav Chizda sheik b'isha erva, right? A woman's leg is going to be considered an erva, as Rashi points out. We're talking here about an ishes ish. What does that mean? We have to put that on the side. Why does Rashi feel the need to say that that's specifically about an Ashes Ish? Continues the Gemara. Shenamar Gali Shek Avari Nar. So if it's talking about Vaslav Gam Tercha Pasach. Fine. Amar Shmuel. Karl Isha Erva. The voice of a woman is considered an erva. What does that mean? Shenamar Kikocha Arev Amarach Anov. Right. It's very sweet. The voice. Again, is this talking about kol, like a speaking voice, or is this talking only about a singing voice? Is this talking about a live singing voice, or is this talking about even a tape singing voice? Again, these are some of the main questions on this topic. We unfortunately do not have the time to go through it right now. Even the hair of a woman is considered an erva. What it means when it's saying the hair of a woman is considered erva, does that mean the hair of of girls or just married women. This again is one of those questions that is discussed. We don't have the time to go into it now. I just wanted to mention one famous Aruch HaShulchan who says as follows: "Va'ata boy." This is in Aruch Chaim, Siman Ayin Vav. The Aruch HaShulchan says, "Va'ata boy v'nitzavech al pirtzis dereinu b'avanesenu rabim." We have to cry about the big fruits of our generation. Right, they are walking around without their heads covered. This is very common in Lithuania pre the war, and this was where Aruch HaShulchan was the rabbi. And everybody was crying about it. Nothing's happening. Nobody's listening. Should also be a menu. The married women are walking around like an unmarried woman, not covering their hair. So after giving the requisite kvetch, krechts, that Nebuch, the situation nowadays, women are not covering the hair. Nevertheless, continues the Aruch HaShulchan, and it says, therefore, we are permitted to recite the Shema, to say brachas, opposite women's hair are uncovered, kevan sha'ata ruben halchos kach, because the majority walks around like that nowadays. And that's just considered like a regular Makkah Megillah now. It's lost its status. All the things that we just said in the Gemara, that all these are considered erva, it's only when it's darker to be concealed, when it's not a normal thing for these things. But if it wouldn't be, if these things would become common, if they would become normative, then it wouldn't be that kind of issue anymore. And even if we're going to cry about it and fetch about it, nevertheless, it would still be permitted to recite the Shema, to make brachas, etc. I should point out that the next halacha here in Siman Ayin Hey, halacha Ches, in Aruch Chaim, he continues and says, "Yesh zomer shmias kol zemer isha b'shas Kriyas Shema." Person should be hearing a woman singing during Kriyas Shema. Feel be'ishta, even his wife. Obviously, if it wouldn't be his wife, then it's also to hear any woman singing, period, at any point in time. But for a wife, it's mutter, except by Kriyas Shema. And that's what it means in the Gemara, kol be'isha erva. I have a kol dibur mutter, but her talking, a woman speaking, no problem. You can still recite the Kriyas Shema. The king kol haragil boy mutter be'ishtay. Gama Kriyas Shema. And similarly, any kol that would be normative for a husband to hear will be mutter even to say Kriyas Shema by hearing that from his wife. And the Aruch HaShulchan also notes, "V'ner the dafka kish mishoyres v'fian." It's only usher when it comes to their singing. But if they're like playing instruments, that's not a situation where it would be usher to say Shema. The Bazil Shach Hira v'Erva. That's not a question of Hira and Erva in that kind of a situation. I should also mention that he talks here about the Erva Bar Sharsis, that if you see an Erva through a covering, like a see-through covering, then that would nevertheless be Asr, because of Liyar B'Chayras Davar, as I mentioned, or as I will mention. I'm sorry, I'm taping this after I did my class today, but I did do in the Gemara today, we did Chafhei Amud Beis, at least we tried to do Chafei Amud Beis. We didn't get all the way through, but where we got to was in fact the situation of Erva Bar Shashis, and the Shemitz Son Malacha talked about whether or not Erva on television, if that would be something that prevents one from saying Shema. The answer, of course, is that it does. Even if the Erva Bar Shashis, what a person would do is to turn the head around to be able to recite the Kriyas Shema. Have a wonderful evening.